And this one's really interesting because it's a 2-player game where each player is going to be creating a dungeon for the other player to try and explore. Players are going to be building their dungeons simultaneously, and each player is going to be starting with the same number of walls, traps, treasures, and monster tokens that they're going to be using in order to create their dungeons. Another thing that's really cool about this is that as you play the game over multiple plays, you're going to be unlocking new components and new monsters that you're going to be able to mix into the game, adding even more variety and more layers of complexity as you get more familiar with the game. The players are going to be building their dungeons behind a screen, and whichever player finishes their dungeon first is going to decide which of the players has to explore the other player's dungeon first. The way this works is that the exploring player is going to be using a pad of paper with a grid on it to represent the dungeon, and then the opponent's going to tell them their starting location and kind of act as dungeon master, telling them what they see and discover as they move through the different locations in that dungeon. You can track all this information on your pad of paper as you discover it, and your goal here is to try and score the most victory points, and the way that you're going to be doing that is by defeating monsters, finding chests, and being first to leave the dungeon. The thing is, you can't actually leave the dungeon until you've either defeated 3 monsters, found 3 chests, or done 2 of each of those. In order to move around the dungeon and take different actions, you're going to be spending action cubes, and once all of those have run out, that's going to be the end of your turn, and then your opponent is going to be doing the same thing, and then it'll come back to you. You're going to have a number of these cubes that you can spend, and you can spend 1 action cube in order to move 1 space, and whenever you do that, you're going to be moving the cubes over to the spent space on your board. You might notice that there's a few different colors of cubes here, and the white ones are just your generic cubes. They don't have any special effects, but the green cube can be used to actually peek into a room before you move into it, which can allow you to discover traps or monsters instead of just being ambushed by them, while the yellow cube can actually allow you to move 3 spaces in 1 action, but you will stop if you run into a monster or a trap. Alternatively, you can also do either of these actions by spending 2 white cubes, but of course this is generally less efficient. If you find a chest, you're going to be drawing a random treasure card from the treasure deck, but then you're also going to be choosing a treasure card from a market, which is going to have a number of these out on display. These can grant you with different special abilities, but can also be used for victory points at the end of the game, with a few options of set collection. But if you happen to walk into a monster or a trap instead, these can have all sorts of different negative effects that can be inflicted on you, with the most basic being dealing some amount of damage. Whenever this happens, you're going to be fatiguing some of your action cubes, which causes them to move into the fatigued space on your board. And the reason you don't want this to happen is because it's going to take 2 turns to get those cubes back, because at the start of your turn, all your cubes move 1 space to the left, and the fatigued space is the furthest on the right you can be on your board. Luckily, if you do still have cubes left when you run into that monster, you can actually spend those cubes in order to get an equivalent amount of dice. And you can roll those dice in order to deal damage, or even sometimes roll those dice to disarm a trap. As I mentioned, the more that you play the game, the more new components and different types of monsters and traps and opportunities you're going to be including into the game, so there is a lot more to be discovered here. But the game essentially continues like this until one of the players meets the requirements to leave the dungeon, and then they find the end of the dungeon. And at that point, they're going to be gaining 4 points for being the first one to leave. And then the other player has 1 turn to also leave the dungeon. And then if they're both able to do that, it's the player with the most victory points that wins. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And of course, you can click to get notified once this one launches.